It was a small Midwestern town near the western edge of Lake Michigan, the kind of place where streets curved gently through residential blocks, where children walked to school, and where neighbors recognized one another by first name. Spring had settled in. The air carried a cool lake breeze. Lawns were turning green again. It was Mother's Day. Families were outside that afternoon. Some were flying kites near the shoreline. Others were grilling in backyards or walking dogs along quiet streets. The rhythm of the day was ordinary and predictable. There was no sense of urgency, no visible tension. Two young girls asked to ride their bikes to a park just a few hundred yards from home. It was a familiar route. They had traveled it before. A paved bike trail cut through open grass and small patches of brush. Children often gathered there. The park was close enough that parents could call out from porches and expect an answer. There was no reason for alarm. Serious violent crime in the town was rare. Parents in communities like this often make decisions based on accumulated experience years without incident. That pattern of safety becomes part of the psychological environment. It shapes risk perception. This happened in broad daylight. That detail matters. Violent acts that occur in spaces perceived as safe disrupt more than lives. They disrupt assumptions. The two girls were elementary school age, close friends. They attended the same school and lived near one another. Their friendship was typical for that stage of development: shared routines, shared secrets, shared time outdoors. At that age, children operate with a limited but growing sense of independence. They understand rules. They recognize familiar streets. They trust the environments they move through daily. Their assessment of danger is shaped largely by adult reassurance and prior experience. They rode their bikes to the park because they had done so before. Nothing in their recent history suggested risk. No reported threats. No warnings circulating in the neighborhood. Their decision to leave that afternoon reflected normal childhood confidence in a familiar setting. That normalcy is part of the tragedy. By evening, when the girls did not return home, concern began to rise. Family members searched the bike trail. Neighbors joined. Police were notified. The search continued into the night. In the early morning hours, their bodies were found in brush near the bike path. Both had been stabbed multiple times. One sustained approximately 20 stab wounds, the other more than 10. The weapon was a knife, a close-contact instrument requiring direct physical proximity. One of the victims later showed evidence of sexual assault. The injuries suggest repeated force, sustained contact, very little physical distance between offender and victims. This was not an attack carried out from afar. It required engagement. It required movement. It required persistence. Multiple stab wounds can indicate intense emotional arousal. They may suggest panic. They may suggest rage. They may suggest sexualized aggression. We do not know the exact psychological state of the offender in those moments. But the nature of the wounds indicates physical immediacy. The violence unfolded quickly and at close range. In the hours that followed, suspicion focused early on a family member. There was a confession. Later, it was withdrawn. Years passed before DNA evidence shifted the direction of the case. Eventually, another individual in a different state was connected through forensic analysis. During that time, additional violent crimes occurred. This case is not simply about who committed the act. It is about how communities interpret violence when it intrudes into safe spaces. It is about how investigators narrow focus under pressure. It is about how systems manage and sometimes mishandle uncertainty. And it is about how violent behavior can escalate over time when not interrupted. The story begins in sunlight, in a park that felt secure. It moves through grief, accusation, and delayed evidence. It forces us to examine not only the act itself, but the structures surrounding it. We begin with what we know. and we begin with what the record does not say. At approximately 3:00 p.m., the two girls left their homes on bicycles. The destination was the neighborhood park a short ride away. This timestamp is based on family recollection and routine memory. It is consistent across statements. Several neighborhood children later confirmed seeing them along the route. They stopped briefly to talk. They appeared calm. Nothing in those encounters suggested distress. These sightings represent the last confirmed observations of the girls alive by independent witnesses. Around 7:00 p.m., that concern began to rise. Dinner time passed. The girls had not returned. Families began calling out along the trail, walking familiar routes, checking the park. By approximately 9:00 p.m., Midas police were contacted. That time is documented. Search efforts expanded. Volunteers joined. Dogs were deployed. The park area received concentrated attention. The bodies were discovered around 6:00 a.m. the following morning. That is the confirmed framework. What falls between 3 p.m. and 6 a.m. contains both fact and absence. There are witness statements. There are search records. But there is no documented observation of the moment of contact between the offender and the victims. This gap, likely measured in minutes, is where the violence occurred. The record distinguishes between confirmed sightings and retrospective accounts. Memory under stress can shift subtly. Times may blur. Perceptions may sharpen around emotion rather than accuracy. That does not invalidate recollections, but it reminds us that timelines are often constructed from fragments. In homicide investigations, the first 6 hours often determine direction. Not because all evidence is gathered then, but because hypotheses begin forming. The weapon was a knife. This is significant. A knife requires proximity. It requires physical contact. It demands sustained motion. One child sustained approximately 20 stab wounds. The other, more than 10. The injuries were not superficial. They were lethal. There was no elaborate staging, no attempt at theatrical display. The bodies were left in brush near the bike path. Concealment was minimal. Repeated stabbing often indicates emotional overdrive. It may indicate panic, particularly if two victims were present simultaneously. It may indicate rage. It may indicate sexualized aggression. It may indicate an immature offender lacking emotional regulation. What the record does not show is equally important. There is no evidence of prolonged captivity, no indication the victims were transported far from the initial area, no signs of complex concealment or post-mortem manipulation, no advanced forensic countermeasures. This suggests the offender may not have possessed extensive criminal experience at that time. The violence appears intense, but not methodically strategic. It suggests immediacy. The bodies were discovered by one of the victims' fathers during continued search efforts. He had a prior criminal history involving aggressive behavior. That fact entered the investigative lens quickly. He was brought in for questioning.
Camera.
I was walking on a dirt trail and I ran into Laura and her friends Crystal on the trail. I told Laura that she had to come home and she argued with me and I grabbed her by the arm. She tried pulling away and was telling me to let her go. Crystal also telling me to let Laura go. Crystal pulled out a small knife from her pocket and again told me to let Laura go. Laura was fighting me and I punched her in the face and she dropped to the ground.
The interrogation lasted more than 20 hours. He eventually signed a confession. Later, he recanted. From a psychological standpoint, prolonged interrogation under conditions of sleep deprivation and acute grief can significantly alter cognitive resilience. The man had just found his daughter deceased. Emotional shock impairs executive functioning. It reduces resistance to suggestion. It increases a desire for resolution. Even resolution in the form of self-incrimination, if it promises rest or escape from interrogation. It suggests investigators formed a working theory early. Behavioral interpretation began before forensic confirmation was complete. When a suspect appears to fit history of aggression, emotional proximity, opportunity confirmation bias can subtly narrow perception. Alternative hypotheses receive less attention. This does not imply malice. It reflects a well-documented cognitive phenomenon in high-pressure investigations. Biological evidence was collected at autopsy. Swabs were taken, samples preserved, they were stored, they were not analyzed immediately. This is the first major deviation in the trajectory of the case. The delay may indicate resource constraints. It may reflect laboratory backlog common in that period. It may suggest that once a confession was obtained, the perceived urgency to analyze remaining evidence decreased. It may also indicate confirmation bias, the belief that the essential narrative had already been established. In investigative psychology, once a theory feels coherent, contradictory data often becomes secondary. The case began to narrow not because all evidence was exhausted, but because one narrative appeared sufficient. That narrowing would shape the next several years, and the silence of untested evidence would carry consequences beyond that single investigation. When we study violent crime, we begin not with the offender, but with the victims. Victimology helps us understand selection, opportunity, and environmental context. The two girls were young, elementary school age, developmentally. They were at a stage defined by expanding independence but limited suspicion. They understood their neighborhood. They trusted familiar spaces. The park was not a risk zone in their minds. It was part of their routine. They were not transient. They were not isolated from community life. They were visible children in a small town. The record later suggests that the offender may have known the area and may have had indirect familiarity with the girls. That detail matters. It may indicate opportunistic selection within a known setting. It may suggest target familiarity. It may indicate reduced fear of being recognized. Offenders who act within familiar environments often experience less psychological friction. The terrain is known. Escape routes are known. Patterns of supervision are known. There is also the question of perceived control. Two children in a quiet park present a low physical barrier to a motivated aggressor. The age difference. If the offender was older, even by a few years, creates a power imbalance. The victim's trust in the setting may have reduced defensive anticipation. That is not blame. It is developmental reality. When violence intrudes into a child's familiar landscape, the rupture is both physical and psychological. And for the offender, acting within that landscape may indicate comfort rather than impulse alone. Years after the murders in the park, a series of violent crimes occurred in another state. There were assaults on adult women. There was kidnapping. There was sexual violence. There was a murder by suffocation. There was increasing boldness in public encounters. These later acts provide behavioral data. Escalation in risk-taking suggests reinforcement. Adrenaline seeking becomes more pronounced over time when earlier acts do not result in apprehension. Sexualized control appears more deliberate. There is evidence of reduced effort to conceal identity during some encounters. That progression matters. It suggests that early violent impulses were not interrupted. It suggests that the absence of immediate accountability may have strengthened the offender's sense of control. It may indicate that initial acts lowered psychological barriers for future ones. Escalation often follows a pattern. Early acts may involve opportunistic aggression. Later acts incorporate planning, repetition, and increasing tolerance for risk. We do not know the full internal narrative of the offender, but behavior leaves traces. The progression from stabbing two children to later adult sexual assaults and suffocation suggests a trajectory rather than isolated events. The pattern indicates increasing confidence. Years after the original investigation, biological evidence was finally entered into a national database. A match was found at the time of the original murders. The individual linked through DNA was 16 years old. Adolescent violent behavior is significant in psychological assessment. Early onset aggression can correlate with persistent antisocial patterns into adulthood. It may indicate poor impulse regulation. It may suggest emerging traits associated with callousness or diminished empathy. It may also indicate fantasy rehearsal preceding action. Violent acts rarely appear without cognitive precursors. Imagined scenarios often precede physical enactment. The record is silent on certain elements. We do not know whether there were prior behavioral warnings. We do not know if there were earlier reports of aggression. We do not know whether any interventions were attempted or considered. We do not know how peers perceived him at that age. That silence matters. In many cases of early violent offending, warning signs are visible in hindsight, but at the time, they may not have crossed legal thresholds for intervention. If the biological evidence had been analyzed immediately, the investigative focus may have shifted. The profile of the offender would likely have changed from a grieving father to an unidentified external suspect. Escalation may have been interrupted. Later victims may have been spared. We do not know. But the delay became a psychological hinge in the narrative. The offender, if aware that he had not been identified, may have internalized that absence of consequence. For some individuals, that absence reinforces behavior. It lowers inhibition, it increases boldness. In psychological terms, reinforcement without punishment strengthens repetition. The turning point in this case was not a dramatic revelation. It was the quiet passage of time. Evidence sat unexamined, a narrative solidified. And in that space, behavior continued elsewhere. Violence rarely begins at its most extreme form. It grows. It adapts. It learns from the environment around it. And sometimes, that environment includes the silence of unresolved evidence. In the years following the murders, one man sat in jail awaiting trial. He had confessed. He had later recanted. The biological evidence collected from the victims had been preserved, but not analyzed. 5 years passed. During that time, there was no confirmed identification of an alternative suspect through forensic testing. The focus of the case remained centered on the individual who had signed a confession under prolonged interrogation. The silence in this period matters. The record does not show broad alternative suspect canvassing once the confession was secured. It does not show early DNA comparison across state databases. It does not show detailed public transparency about forensic backlog or the status of stored evidence. That absence is not necessarily evidence of neglect. It may reflect routine procedure at the time, but it shaped the course of events. When a case appears resolved, investigative momentum often slows. Resources shift to other urgent matters. Evidence sits, waiting for re-evaluation that may not come without external pressure. The 5-year gap was not dramatic. It was quiet. And in that quiet, the narrative hardened. To understand the delay, we must consider context. In the early 2000s, forensic capacity across the United States was uneven. Many jurisdictions faced significant laboratory backlogs. DNA analysis was powerful, but not always immediate. Smaller departments often depended on regional facilities. Budget constraints influenced prioritization. Interrogation practices during that period were also less publicly scrutinized than they are today. Long sessions were common. Confession was often regarded as the strongest form of evidence. Once obtained, it could overshadow other investigative leads. It suggests structural inertia. It suggests resource limitations. It suggests a cultural reliance on confession as a decisive endpoint. None of these factors imply malicious intent. They illustrate how institutional processes can unintentionally narrow inquiry. When evidence confirms an existing belief, there is less psychological incentive to revisit unanswered questions. Cognitive bias operates quietly. Confirmation bias does not announce itself. It works subtly, reinforcing what seems coherent. In this case, once a confession aligned with prior suspicion, the urgency to challenge that alignment diminished. For the families, the silence was not procedural, it was emotional. Grief was already profound, but uncertainty layered on top of grief creates a different psychological burden. Was the right person responsible? Was the community safe? Were there unanswered questions when a case stretches over years without clarity? Families experience suspended mourning. Closure becomes conditional. Trust in the system may weaken. Community cohesion can fracture under doubt and rumor. For the wrongfully accused on prolonged incarceration under accusation of killing one's own child destabilizes identity. The trauma of interrogation does not disappear when charges are dismissed. It lingers in memory and physiology, sleep disruption, hypervigilance, social isolation, long-term functional damage. The silence in the file is not just investigative, it is human. Cold cases rarely remain unsolved because the offender is exceptionally strategic. In many instances, they remain unresolved because of convergence. Evidence is delayed. Early narrative dominates. Systems resist course correction. When an initial theory takes root, revisiting it requires institutional humility. That is not always easy in high-profile cases. Cold cases often emerge from human bias, interacting with limited data and procedural rigidity. They are shaped by resource allocation, by laboratory timelines, by psychological investment in early conclusions. In this case, the delay in analyzing biological evidence did not occur in isolation. It occurred within a structure that believed it had already found its answer. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was administrative. It was incremental. And over time, incremental silence can resemble certainty. Understanding how that happens is essential, not to assign blame in hindsight, but to recognize how systems can unintentionally narrow the field of truth. The absence of data is not neutral. It shapes perception. And sometimes, it shapes years after the original investigation. Biological evidence collected from the crime scene was entered into a national DNA database. A match was returned. That match altered the legal landscape immediately. Charges were filed. Proceedings moved forward in separate jurisdictions. Convictions were obtained. The individual identified through DNA received a death sentence in one state and multiple life sentences in another. From a legal standpoint, closure occurred. The case that had once narrowed around a confession now shifted to forensic confirmation. The name attached to the DNA replaced the earlier narrative. Officially, responsibility was assigned. But legal closure and psychological closure are not the same. DNA provides identification. It answers a specific question: who was present? It does not automatically answer why. DNA confirms biological presence. It does not confirm the sequence of events. It does not reveal the psychological trigger that preceded violence. It does not reconstruct the exact interaction between offender and victims. It does not tell us whether the children recognized their attacker. It does not tell us what was said or not said in their final moments. For families and communities, those unanswered details can weigh heavily. Narrative matters. Understanding matters. The record is silent on several aspects. We do not have a comprehensive public confession detailing the events in the park. We do not have a fully articulated motivational narrative. We do not have a clear developmental pathway explaining how a 16-year-old progressed to lethal violence. DNA offers certainty about identity. It does not provide a full psychological map. Technology can illuminate a fragment of the picture. The rest remains shaped by inference, behavior patterns, and silence. Following exoneration, a civil settlement was reached. Financial compensation was provided to the man who had spent 5 years incarcerated for a crime he did not commit. No officers were criminally charged. Institutional criticism emerged through media and public discourse. Policies evolved gradually in response to broader conversations about interrogation practices and forensic testing delays. It suggests systems adapt slowly. Structural correction tends to occur incrementally, often after external scrutiny. Consequences for investigative error are uneven. Some individuals bear personal cost. Institutions absorb criticism and adjust procedure over time. This pattern is not unique to one jurisdiction. It reflects a broader tension within justice systems, the balance between urgency and accuracy. The case demonstrates how legal processes can correct themselves eventually. It also demonstrates how delayed correction carries human consequences. We know that 2 children were killed in a familiar place in broad daylight. We know that biological evidence linked the crime to another individual years later. We know that a man spent 5 years incarcerated for a crime he did not commit. We know that during those years, additional victims were harmed before identification occurred. We do not know what preceded the attack in the park. We do not know whether earlier intervention was possible. We do not know how many warning signs, if any, went unnoticed in adolescence. The value of studying this case is not in shock. It is not in dramatic revelation. It is not in resolution alone. It is in understanding how violence can begin early and escalate when unaddressed. It is in recognizing how investigative focus can narrow under pressure. It is in acknowledging how evidence can sit unused. It is in accepting that certainty can feel solid and still be incomplete. Some questions remain unanswered. Responsible analysis does not attempt to fill those gaps with speculation. It acknowledges them. It learns from them. In the end, this case reminds us that justice is a process, not a moment. Technology can provide a name. It can provide legal accountability. But understanding human behavior and the systems that respond to it requires patience, humility, and a willingness to sit with ambiguity. And sometimes, the most honest conclusion is this: we know enough to assign responsibility. We do not know enough to explain everything.